What? Sam? Oh, hey all. All right, I guess it's time to get back to learning about cognitive. Am I muted or not? No, I'm not. We got some thunder coming in. All right. So where I want to start off, we got to pick up where we left off with attention. I'll give you a little bit of a review, but I wanted to talk about this week's reading. If you remember, it's Neath, and that should be up there. Now, I don't know if you tried to read it or not. I was looking at it. There's some vocabulary and historical points. So I just want to make a few statements about it. Maybe if you've read it, you could skim it over again and it might make more sense. Or if you haven't read it, maybe take a couple notes on what I'm saying. But so if you notice, the name of the chapter is the modal model. And a lot of this goes into the short-term memory presentation that I'm going to get to this week, but I'll eat my hat if I make it to short-term memory today, right? We got a lot of attention to get to still. And so the modal model, you've seen on my attention slides where it's like, what's that, like a sensory register, maybe like short-term store, long-term memory. I guess I don't really have it laid out by that, but see, right about like the late 1960s, people had come to assume that, or, there was lots of theories of the components of the mind and the components of memory. A lot of differences between them, a lot of assumptions, but in general, people assumed that there was a sensory register, there was a short-term memory, and there was a long-term memory. For the most part, these were things that everybody believed in. That's the modal model. It's the one you see in, for instance, an intro to psychology textbook where it'll be like, this type of memory, then short-term memory, then long-term memory. The reason it's called the modal model, it's like mean, median, and mode. Mode being this is what you see most often, right? So it's, right? Most theories assume these components of memory, all right? So that's what it means by that. He also references iconic memory, which I typically don't get to until later in the class. Iconic and echoic memory are two forms of sensory memory. They, when it says sensory register, right, these are specific types of memory that only exist in the senses. They're a little bit different from the actual sensation. So, for instance, if you stare at something for a while and you close your eyes, you see an after image. That after image you see is actually a chemical response. I'll get into that later, but there's a step after that where your eyes hold on to this brief memory of what you've seen, and your ears do the same thing. So iconic memory, when he references that, it's just a brief sensory memory of visual images. Echoic memory, when he references that, it's just a brief memory of sound. Right, some of the other points to that, he talks about primary memory a lot. You can think about that for now, just like he's saying short-term memory. Primary memory is a little more specific than short-term memory. It's what I'd be more inclined to call it the focus of attention, right? Primary memory is really what's in consciousness right now. It's the portion of memory that is so active that you're aware of it, right? Short-term memory would be a little more broad than that. For instance, you could rehearse a number in your head, but pay attention to something else. And you're not really focusing on that number, but you're saying it over and over. You got these rehearsal streams. So that wouldn't really be primary memory, the focus of attention, what you're rehearsing in your head, because you're kind of doing that so you don't have to focus on it, right? Like you can count from 1 to 10 in your head while doing something else, right? Yeah, so short-term memory, a little more broad, but don't worry about it. When you see primary memory, you can think about it like he's saying short-term memory for now. He references William James several times. who's often given credit for creating the distinction between what we would call primary memory and secondary memory. Very similar to short-term memory and long-term memory. Not quite the same concept, but not enough for me to get into a big deal about. Just if you see primary memory, think about it as kind of like a short-term memory. If you see him talk about secondary memory, kind of like a long-term memory. Maybe we'll get into the distinctions, but right now it's too subtle of a thing for me to make a big issue out of. Now, because I said that I will eat my hat if we get into the short-term memory today, I'll give you a little bit of clue where, I say every week the reading might involve, the reading can wind up on the quiz. Well, since I might not get to any short-term memory slides, I'll probably pull something from the reading. So let me give you some hints about where you should pay attention. There's a section on Miller with his plus or minus 7, and it also talks about the memory span task. Make sure you read that. And then there's a part where it talks about the Brown-Peterson paradigm. Make sure you read about that. Very good chance that one or both of those topics could wind up on the quiz. So develop a basic understanding of them. Any questions? Yep. All right. So let's let me find my slide. Let's do some a little bit of a moment of review here. It was this. And let me just clear this so that it doesn't beep at me a bunch. All right. So you shouldn't have to take notes for these first few slides, stuff we were talking about last Thursday, but I want to get you back up to date. So I'll slow down when we get to the end of Cherry, which if you remember, that's where we left off. If you don't remember, that's where we left off. That's why we're doing this. So if you remember the concept of a cocktail party film, this formed the basis of early attention studies, just that idea that you could be in a group of people and everybody's talking, but you can pay attention to one stream of vocalizations and block out all the other ones, right? But what are the steps that the brain accomplishes to allow for that, right? What are the processing steps that are necessary? And so one, we have the sensory register. That's where, when I was talking about iconic and echoic memory, right? Just that memory for things that are in the senses. At some point, memory must be contacted in order for us to recognize something, right? I can't recognize, well, if you're struggling with that concept, think about when you hear somebody speaking in a language that you don't speak, right? When people speak in a language that you know, it sounds slow, and you hear breaks in between the words, right? As I'm speaking, those of you who, the better you are at English, the more you're going to hear my words as sectioned off, right? Somebody who doesn't know English would hear me speaking as one continuous stream of noise and not know how to parse it out, right? That's why when you see people speaking a language that you don't know, it sounds really fast and just continuous, like blah, 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 is what it sounds like, right? It's because your brain doesn't know how to section the words out, right? But for instance, if we were to record my voice on a computer, you would just see one steady waveform with no breaks in between any of my words, right? It's just, you have memory for the words, the brain activates the memory, right? So the senses activate memory. At some point, things enter conscious awareness, but the whole room doesn't enter conscious awareness, only that conversation that you're having. So the question we were asking is, when does attention filter out all the noise? The early selection theory is that it cuts out sensory information on the way to memory, and it only lets sensory information that's relevant through. And the late, right, and that only makes it to awareness. And then the late selection theory, if you remember, was that everything is making contact with memory and activating memory, but, right, attention is picking out what seems to be contextually relevant. All right. So you remember the dichotic listening task then. You got your headphones on. This makes it so that you can't move your head and improve one sound over the other, right? It's just, it is what it is. Things are coming into this ear and I'm repeating whatever's said in this ear. things are coming into this year and I'm ignoring this year, right? So, and we call the one that I'm repeating the shadowed message. And so what do people remember about it? Cherry said that people don't remember anything about the content of the ignored message, right? The content is completely lost. So if you repeat a word 35 times in the ignored ear, people don't report hearing it. And as I said, I do this in class. I'll have somebody shadowing a voice over there, and over here I'm reading a book, and then I'm just saying Chicago in their ear a bunch of times, and they don't hear it, right? People don't notice when the messages flips in reverse, right? So the words start getting played backwards, which is important because, as I was saying, language, our brain knows how to parse things up, and, it uses memory to do that, but you're not even, when it's going to something that the brain can parse, it's not distracting or attention drawing when the words start playing backwards, right? And people don't notice when language changes from English to German. In this case, we're assuming that most of these people probably were not German speakers, which, would, again, you would think that might be distracting or noteworthy, but it's not.
Can you go back?
Oh, sorry, what's up?
I was going to say, could you go back to that dichotic slide real quick, the dichotic listening?
Sure, what do you need to know about it?
I just didn't get the last part of this sentence, that was all, just from my notes.
Which one? Is it this one?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Alright,
yep.
Cool. But anyway, so, well, he's right in that. I can just bring up the fact that, people would, if it changes to a solid tone, people will notice that, right? If it changes from words to beeps, people know that. If it changes, my ignored ear was a male speaker, and it changes to a female voice, people notice that, right? And so this is where we left off. Cherry concluded that in, let's say, a cocktail party phenomenon where there's or a situation where there's all these voices around you, the reason you hear that one that you're paying attention to, it's because your brain is using basic sensory features to pick out the voice that you want to pay attention to, right? Would this be early or late selection?
Would it be late? Because late talks about how there's permanent.
It's early, actually.
Okay.
The point being, and this is where the distinction is, and thank you, everybody always says late, but it's actually early. The idea here being that it's early because it's before you even recognize what the signal is, it's just the basic features that really are just stimulation in my ear that matches a certain frequency, right? A certain consistency. Which would be, think about it. When you're at a cocktail party, you can speak to more than just the person in front of you. You can start to ignore them and pay attention to the conversation off to your side, right? But that person in front of you starts to disappear too. The idea being that you've just switched the sensory features that you're attending to. Now, so this, right, so it favors this early selection, right? You're at the attention filter, sensory register, what are the vocal features? That's what's getting passed on to memory. All right. So that seems pretty clean. Broadbent, who was the person who put all of this together and really developed the first theory, not only of attention, but of the interactions between attention and memory. At least the first real data-driven one. I guess you could say, William James, who did I skip William James, right? The founder of American psychology. He talked about that kind of stuff, but he didn't like doing experiments. He just wanted to be a philosopher and let other people do the experiments instead. He talked about these kinds of things, but it really didn't become formal for another, 40, 50 years when Broadbent started doing his work. And Broadbent produced the first modification to this concept of early and late selection, which was to bring in what we might call the short-term store, He called it the S system. Now we might call it short-term memory, I guess. But there's a really good reason. Now, I'll get to the data behind why he would include this, but it's really easy to imagine why you would have to fit this into the model, this short-term store. The reason being that, right, so sometimes you can reference back, right? Something got filtered out, right? But you can reference back, and it's, you know, you're sitting in your room and you're thinking about something, right? You're just sitting there. Wow, I've almost got the same look on my face as she does, except I need to be like that. All right. So I'm usually not sitting at a tip. So all right, so I'll just get the same look going on. You're sitting there, you're thinking about something. Friend walks up behind you, asks you a question. You're like, what? Your friend's about to repeat it, and then you answer it because he was kind of echoing around in your ear, right? That's basically what he's talking about, that there's a system for that. Now, he didn't propose that just on that, but based on the fact that the data showed that there is something like this. I'll show you why. We'll see how this works out. We might not be able to, usually I show this experimentally, but it requires like 3 people making noise and stuff. So let's see what we can do. It says middle part of the room. I think we'll just have like 1 person, maybe 2 people. Can I get a volunteer to do this? It's really easy.
Sure.
All right. So all you need to do is going to be these numbers come up on the screen. When you get the question mark, just write down what they are. All right. I should say it's straightforward. It's not always easy, but all right. Ready, set, go. So what were the numbers?
26719, and I missed something in the middle.
I think it was 5. 261795, right? And that's fine. We're on the internet and everything's squirrely, right? But, you know, it's pretty easy to remember that. Now, here's where it could be more difficult. Let's have you do this again. All right. So you're going to see numbers, and they're going to come up on the right and left. Actually, it says recall however works best for you. I don't want you to do that. You're going to see numbers come up on the right and left, like boom, 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 right? So there'll be 6 numbers again, but they'll be split on the right and left. What I want you to do is try to recall the numbers that you saw on the left side of the screen first, and then try to recall the numbers that you saw on the right side of the screen. Now, normally people would be saying this, so I don't know how this is going to work, but right, you got me? So it'll be like 1 set, 2 set, 3 set, but then recall the 3 you saw on this side, then recall the 3 you saw on this side, right? Ready, set, go.
Two, 7, 5, 9, 6, 1.
2, 7, 5, 9. Oh, damn, you got it. All right. Now, that's really tough to do visually, so congratulations. Right. So normally, when Broadbent invented this, and this goes back to the 1940s when he was working with the British military, trying to figure out what radio operators could hear, right, and what they could deal with. He was in the beginning of what we now call human factor psychology. And pilots would radio in with a call sign first. So you'd always give like a 3-digit number and then talk, right? And so this whole idea of hearing 3-digit numbers come over your ears is really important, because at what point are people getting overrun by all this noise, right? Again, it wasn't like you had the, independent channels for everything the way you do now. It was just back then, and everybody was just barking over a radio, and they didn't know how much a human could take, right? So with this, he'd do something just like what we saw there, all right? Now, if people were supposed to do it in order, now, I gave you what was probably the harder version to do visually, but actually sonically is the easier version. Because if you tell people, recall the numbers in order. So you have to remember 2 and then 7, and then you have to remember 6 and 9. Then you have to remember 1 and 5. That's really tough. People might get to like 2, 6, 7. Most of the time, if you just put the numbers in order, people can remember 6 digits, right? I mean, phone numbers are 7 digits long, and people can remember that. But it's really tough to switch between your ears and remember, right? It's that dying echo in the short-term store, right? Now, if you let people do whatever they want, what they will do is they'll reference one ear, they'll say 261, then they'll reference the other ear, say 795, super easy, right? And that's where this idea of the short-term store comes from. Short-term memory, really, the beginnings of it was this. So, right, this is what's getting played in each ear. 261 coming over this ear, 795 coming over this ear. With using my attention filter, I just let this ear straight through into conscious awareness, and I just report 261. And then that 795 is just kind of echoing in the short-term store. I think back, and I can reference it. I let it through, right? 795. Now, if I try to do 276,915, right? That's real difficult because you're shifting attention between basically the two streams of information. The short-term store is not going to last that long. Sensory memory is really short, and all of it is gone. But you can recall information that came into one ear, then reference back to the other one, right? With minimal interference, minimal forgetting. Okay, so the historical significance of this, and one of the reasons I bring this up, is as we move toward the modern perspectives of memory, this, to the best of my knowledge, was the first time anybody had ever proposed what we would call a working memory system. A working memory system being this system where people maintain information, but attention is also helping. Attention and memory are working together to produce basically what's consciously available to you, right? You're not always conscious of everything, but memory and attention can function together. Maybe sometimes you got to sit some stuff back in memory, and also holding something in memory makes it easier for you to attend to things. Right? We've already seen a couple instances of that. I'll come back to that in a moment, though. The important part, though, was that Broadbent built this great theory of attention, and what do you do with theories? You attack them right away, right? And it came under fire really hard. So how did it fall apart? Well, in a famous example, Gray and Wedderburn, 1960, they made a simple change to broadband splits band. So Ted, if you could give me one more go at this, you'll see the 2 words coming up, or right, the 2 things coming up. Recall it however is most easy for you, all right? You don't need to follow any rules, just do what you want, all right? Ready, set, go. Just things screwed up. All right, well, let's try it again, although now you've seen the answer, but just try it again, or just tell me what you think is the most easy. All right, so what was the answer to that? What did you see on the screen?
Mike ate 2 cheese. Oh, no, oh.
Well, what's the easiest way to recall that?
Cheese pie.
All right, well, you're probably right. But most people don't take that difficult of a route. Right? You're being very Broadbentian, but I said do it however you want, right? Now, most people don't do that. Broadbent's theory predicts that people would do what you just did, right? Which is mice 2, cheese 8, eat 5. Although you struggled with that, right? In general, when people are sat down in this task, what do you think their response is? when they're asked just to recall everything. Maybe anybody chime in. It's a pretty easy solution here. What would you say if you heard these coming over? You heard mice ate to eat cheese 5, right? Coming over your headphones with those being played at the same time. What's the easiest way to recall that?
Categorize the words and numbers.
Yeah, so mice eat cheese 825, right? Is what you're saying, right? And that's what people typically do, right? This is a problem for early selection. It's a problem for early selection because early selection was saying that things would be based on features, qualities of the voice. People are not picking things based on the quality of the voice. They're remembering based on meaning. Except for Ted, who decided to take the hard route, but people do that every now and again. Some people like things more complicated than they need to be. In general, people group these things based on meaning, not based on, which ear it was coming into. So this is a crack in the wall, right, of early selection, right? It suggests something deeper is going on. And this became more apparent with the study by Morey. He was thinking about this cocktail party phenomenon, and I've already talked about this a little bit, right? Cherry and Broadbent, they were assuming that, you're at a party, you're talking to someone in front of you, and you're using attention to filter out all the noise, right? But if you're really filtering, then why does your head snap to attention when somebody on the other side of the room says your name, right? Your name just comes out of that noise, grabs your attention and pulls you in, right? I've done this in front of their class lots of times. It's really easy to make somebody screw up when they're trying to do something like a shadowing task. You just say their name. So something is getting through, right? Whereas Cherry and Broadbent were saying that everything that's outside of attention is just getting pushed away. This is showing something is coming through, grabbing attention and pulling it over. So Morey actually did a modified dichotic listening task, and man, 1959, this must have been impossible. I mean, you can do this real easy. What he did, by shadowing a story in one ear, the unattended ear, the subject's name gets spliced in there. So it was the best of times, it was the John Smith of times, right? Now, think about this in the 1950s. You either have to make a recording for every subject in there, or you record their voice and maybe take a razor blade and tape it back together and splice it into the tape, right? But this was all analog. It must have been a real damn chore to run this experiment, is what I'm saying. But what he found is 33% of the time, people stop shadowing right after the name was played. So my name comes into the unattended ear, I lose concentration, I screw up, right? When people didn't lose concentration, they didn't recall hearing their name, but it is evidence that things are not blocked out completely, right? Now, some students have pointed out that 33% is a small number, and I'll get back to that. But for now, let's just focus on the part that it's really inconsistent that, everything I've said up to this point, that people didn't recognize when words changed from German or English to German and when they reversed. It's really inconsistent with that theoretical perspective that we're only attending to vocal qualities. If, something with a different quality breaks through because it's your name, right? So, all right, so blah, blah, blah. So I don't know if that was on the thing, but why is it a problem? Don't worry about writing that down. I already said that. But if you remember what I was talking about, a couple weeks back, I was talking about theories and how there's anomalies. There's things that don't fit in with the theory. So what's the first step you typically take, if you remember? What did I suggest people do when anomalies begin to arise in a theory? No one really remembers that one? That's good. That's okay. I had one student in the history of this class ever actually remembered back. It's hard to remember a couple weeks ago, right? You make minor modifications to the theory. Right. So you modified the theory, and that is what Broadbent's grad student Ann Treisman did. We've already talked about. No, we haven't. We've already skipped slides with her work. She worked at Princeton until she died a couple of years ago. Very long career. But so she modified her advisor's theory. Said that attention doesn't really filter out signals. It's attenuating signals. It's requiring a higher criterion before you pay attention to something, right? So you can see that whereas the arrows on the unattended thing, they're not gone like I was drawing in the early selection before. Instead, they're just weaker, right? Attention is weakening signals that are not consistent, right? But, you know, there are things that can be relevant, right? Something that's contextually relevant, it's going to break through. And there is no context in which your name is not relevant, right? If somebody says your name, it's important. And so it's always going to break through. Now, you know, most of the time something won't, but, you know, like the mice eat cheese thing, right? Where it's skipping between ears. You know, attention doesn't just cutting things out. And words, right? If you hear mice, then eat is going to be more relevant than the number 2, right? So attention is just going to kind of follow that path. So that was good, and some people still use this mode of thought, but in general, early selection really fell out of favor for a long time based on some studies, like Moray's, but you see some other stuff, right? Like, for instance, Courtine and Wood. This was brought up last time, but it's important because, well, all right, let me explain it. They're doing dichotic listening. Here's the thing you're listening to, here's the thing you're not listening to. And people never got distracted by the unattended message in this study in any way, shape, or form that you would see visually. But there were other smaller physiological reactions that were noted. So what happens? Second instance of people getting electrocuted for a psychological study, really, like, you know, when you're in those little studies and you're bored, you know, thank God for the IRB, because up until then, they just electrocuted everybody that came in. I can provide evidence that this was very common. But anyway, when we will. But what the subjects did was, I think they had three cities. I think it was Toronto, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, if I remember correctly. But let's just say those are the ones, right? And before they were in the dichotic listening study, they got electric shocks paired with those words. So every time you would hear one of those cities, you would get a mild electrocution, right? Then I think there were 3 other cities that were not. But the important point was people developed an association, right? The learning part of this class. People developed an association between the names of these 3 cities and receiving an electric shock. Now, if you know galvanic skin response, which is typically like a lie detector, right? It's when you feel anxiety, right? Lie detector is really an anxiety detector, not a lie detector, by the way. So I don't know. Don't ever really trust it, because all it's really telling you is this question making me anxious in a way that leads to a physiological response? But you do sweat a little bit, right? Your skin becomes a little more conductive when you feel anxiety. And so they put them in this dichotic listening test with the same kind of sensors that you would use on a lie detector, right? So they're going along and repeating this message, and, right, I'm ignoring this message, and, you know, Toronto comes over, right? I don't get pulled off task. I keep going. I'm shadowing perfectly, right? Pittsburgh comes over. It doesn't distract me. I'm shadowing perfectly. Chicago comes over, right? But right after those words are played, you see the galvanic skin response. People sweat just a little bit, right? Even though they don't ever become consciously aware of their anxiety, there's evidence that, yeah, those memories were activated in the brain, because how else are you going to see this anxiety response unless people recognize those names, right? So that's interesting because, I mean, it's interesting for two reasons. One, it shows this late selection kind of thing, that everything is activated in memory and we're only picking what's relevant. But two, you think about things like, why is the word out of my head now? Subliminal messages, or anything subliminal, things that you never really realize are going on in the environment still maybe affect you a little bit. This is proof that that kind of thing can happen, right? I don't become aware of things, but they still have a minor effect on me. Now, that said, subliminal effects are never going to be that huge. They're tiny, right? And they're inconsistent. So, some people will talk about, you hear the urban legend about, the movie theater owner who slipped a few friends a drink Coke into his movies. The guy made that up. It never happened. The idea was, people would see drink Coke and they would get up and go buy the Coke. But as my social psychology professor, who actually studied subliminal effects, said, it's not going to turn you